is Professor Howard Resnick from the Bhaktivedanta Institute, USA, and his talking is devoted to reason, Buddhi in the Bhagavad Gita.
Thank you very much. My little talk is not going to be very ambitious in the sense that I'm not really going to make a few arguments, but I want to clarify or introduce or explain a different way, perhaps, a different way of thinking about reason itself. And I'm going to focus on the Bhagavad Gita, which is definitely one of the most important books of philosophy or reason from the South Asian tradition, Sanskritic tradition, associated in some ways with Hinduism. So I'm going to focus on a few key terms from the Bhagavad Gita and try to explain those terms. And in doing so, hopefully you'll understand how the Bhagavad Gita approaches the whole issue of being rational or reasonable or logical and so on. So the main term I'm going to focus on is Buddhi, Buddhi, Buddhi. And so I'll begin by giving you a definition of the word from the standard Sanskrit English dictionary by Monier Williams at Oxford. And actually, I just want to say quickly, speaking of Oxford, that I enjoyed Professor Priest's talk very much, found it very interesting. But in the Bhagavad Gita, or the word Buddhi, or in the Sanskrit dictionary, means the power of forming and retaining conceptions and general notions, intelligence, reason, intellect, mind, discernment, judgment. And in certain contexts, which we have here in the Gita, it means intellect, the intellectual faculty or faculty of mental perception. And so in this definition, so I think that's clear. So let me go to the actual verses from the Gita in chapter 2, text 39. A bunch of quotations, feel like I'm on Sunday morning television. Anyway, in chapter 2, text 39, Krishna, the speaker, says, Esha te bhita sankhye yoge tvimang shrinu. That he says that what I've just explained to you is buddhi, or this reason or intelligence, discrimination, in the sense of Sankhya. So if you can just bear with me, I'm just going to define one more word here, Sankhya, and then I'm going to just stop. This whole thing's not going to be out of the dictionary. Sankhya in Sanskrit as a noun means, it can mean a person who calculates or discriminates as well. Discriminate in the sense of to recognize distinctions, to differentiate, to correctly categorize, from a root meaning to enumerate or to reckon things. So what Krishna is saying here, I think this is very important, is that buddhi, probably the best Sanskrit word for reason or rationality, has a philosophical sense, purely philosophical or intellectual, but also an active sense. It's the sense that reason, to be complete, ultimately must be applied in life. So the sense of applied reason. And the word for the application or reason in action is actually yoga, which is, conjures up different images now in the Western world, something, like making your body limber and so on. But actually, yoga in Sanskrit means application or process. So first of all, you have this idea that reason, when it's functioning properly, has a philosophical sense where you just discern and discriminate and understand and analyze, but also a sense in which you have to apply it. And in fact, if you can't apply it, then something's wrong. So sometimes I know when I was younger and I took philosophy courses and I took the history of Western philosophy, you always learn that the Greeks did something new because unlike the Egyptians who did basic geometry to reassess property boundaries after the Nile flooded, that in Greek or Western philosophy, we call it philosophy in the Western sense because it was knowledge for its own sake. And what always struck me about that, I remember when I heard that, I always thought there's something really confused about that, because in the dictionary, to be for the sake of something, it means for the purpose of something in the interest of something. But I mean, the knowledge itself, like let's say you have some basic geometric knowledge. I mean, the knowledge itself doesn't have purposes or interests because, I mean, for example, rules governing isosceles triangles, triangles aren't people, as far as I know. So they don't have purposes. They don't have interests. They're not trying to achieve anything, but rather the person who knows, let's say, geometry, has a purpose or an interest. So knowledge for its own sake can be a misleading phrase because it's really for the sake of the knower. The knower has some vested interest in knowing. So in that sense, I would say that knowledge, which comes as a result of seeking it or studying it and so on, is a priori teleological, because if you don't have some purpose in doing something, you generally don't do it. So so the notion that, like that old saying, you shall, excuse me, know the truth, and the truth will set you free, that knowledge is liberating. Knowledge is somehow edifying. It is, it makes life better in some way. And so I think this is what Krishna is getting at, that the practice of reason, somehow it's teleological, it's purposive, it somehow enriches life. And in that sense, if something enriches one's life, one would assume that one has integrated it into one's practical activities. Otherwise, there's, of course, the danger of hypocrisy. And so this distinction of Sankhya and yoga, that sort of a purely analytic understanding of things, and then the application of that knowledge in a way that enriches life or even brings enlightenment or whatever it may be, I think is not an exotic notion. I think it's in its own way universal. So I want to go on talking about Buddhi, this analytic faculty, and Krishna says a number of things about it, about Buddhi, just to give the idea of how this ancient culture, Sanskritic culture, is conceiving of the faculty of reason, the fruits of reason, the applications of reason, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in text 241, Krishna talks about, he says, Vyavasayatmika buddhirekeha, that when Buddhi, when intelligence, when reason is fully resolved, that it becomes one. And I think what Krishna means here by saying that one's intelligence, one's Buddhi, one's reason is fully resolved, determined, is that one is determined to act upon it. One is determined to have a rational life, a reasonable life. And somehow there's a singular, unitary understanding of life, obviously including one's rational self-interest. And even though the world is clearly full of variety and at times chaotic, apparently, but still, somehow or other, there's some underlying notion. I really like what Professor Priest was saying, and I don't want to try to draw too many connections here, but the notion of some unitary, singular, or integral aspect of existence as existence. And so Krishna says there is a type of determined reason that is singular, even though it deals with many different things, and that those who are not determined, abhyavasayinang, that for those who are not really existentially resolved, you could say, in the pursuit of knowledge, in the pursuit of truth, in the pursuit of the best possible understanding, that this reason, this reasonable, clear understanding of everything does not actually take place. So again, I'm just throwing things out, trying, and hopefully a composite picture will emerge. Part of this determined reason, or a big part of it is, just to put it bluntly, is that one should understand life or being well enough not to live a selfish life. So at 249, Krishna says that Buddho Sharanam Anvicha, that literally it's in the imperative form, Anvicha, seek, one should seek shelter or refuge in higher understanding. So that somehow higher understanding gives you some type of existential protection. And that those who are phalahitava, those who are working selfishly, don't really get it. They're the word kripana, they're small-minded, mean-spirited, or whatever. That to be selfish is not to understand reality. There's something about the nature of reality so that people who really understand it, their minds and hearts open, and they want to serve others. So there's another thing about Buddhi, where Krishna says at 250, this little section in the second chapter, Buddhi yukto jahati haube sukrita duskrite, which means in Sanskrit that if someone is really engaged with Buddhi, with this higher reason, this understanding, if someone is really connected with it literally, then one gives up mundane activities, and Krishna says sukrita and duskrita. In other words, let's say pious and impious. It's a simple way to put it. Which means that ultimately reason finds a truth or an existence or reality which is beyond the mundane, and which is in some way metaphysical, and somehow undergirds or explains or makes possible the existence of mundane things, but somehow is apart from it. These things are explained in detail in a more ontological sense elsewhere in the Gita, but I'll just go on with Buddhi here. We are also warned that we are told that if one's Buddhi, if one's faculty of reason is really working properly, one will not be misled by mundane authorities, including scriptures, including mundane. In this case, Krishna, of course, is mostly talking about Sanskrit scriptures, or books that are considered sacred, books that are considered authoritative in general, that one should not be misled if one really understands things as they are. And there's a bunch of stuff on that, which I won't go into here. And that a statement 263, if you lose this reason, you lose yourself. Somehow to be in touch with oneself, to have even a rudimentary state of self-realization, to know the basics about how you exist. Again, a lot of things Professor Priest said are kind of still echoing in my mind, but to understand yourself as yourself, I mean, the fact that you are you and so on, that will be lost if you lose this Buddhi, this reason, including metaphysical reason. You will lose yourself in a sense. And that you cannot keep your Buddhi, you cannot keep this reasonable understanding unless you are connected. And so I'm going to say where the word connected, of course, is yukta. And yukta grammatically is another form of the word yoga. Yoga means to link. We have linguistic echoes of this in English, like the word yoke, where you yoke the oxen, something most of us don't do nowadays. But to yoke things together, also echoes, for example, in the word conjugal, jugal, the sense of yoking and or linking, and there are many other cognates, but still. So ayukta means one who is not connected, not linked to the higher truth, you could say, which is the object of Buddhi. It's that very metaphysical or ultimately transcendent reality which explains everything, which sustains everything, and it's by being, unless one is connected to that reality, one will not really have this resource of Buddhi. One will not be able to reason in the highest sense unless one, and I mean, if you think about it, this reminds me of epistemological foundationalism. I mean, there's some, as Aristotle pointed out, there's some given epistemic foundation. You have to accept something as self-evident, and anyway, I won't go into what I think are the serious limitations of coherentism as an epistemic alternative, but assuming that something like foundationalism is the case, then we can only reason within what we can perceive to be real. And so one's powers of perception of what is real, and I think of Plato's divided line, different levels of existence. And again, I'm thinking of things that Professor Priest said, but that if one has, the idea here in the Gita is that one has this metaphysical awareness, then one is able to reason on that higher level because you just have more facts. It's like geometric reasoning. The more that's given, the more you can know and reason. And if nothing is given, you really can't reason. So I think even geometry, in that sense, is depends upon this type of epistemic foundation. Nothing given, nothing reasoned. So then try to get a few more things in. Let's see. That if one possesses this buddhi, one realizes a certain oneness and equality of all things. I mean, for example, obviously we all have different bodies. We all have different levels of intelligence, athletic ability, musical ability, mathematical ability, and so on. So in practically every conceivable way, empirically, we're not equal, and yet there is an equality. Our political system is based upon it, the notion of equal justice, the notion of equal rights. So is there an actual ontological foundation for this notion of equality, or is it just sentiment? So according to the Gita, if your buddhi is working properly, then you do see a real ontological equality of all that exists, sharing existence, and especially of all sentient or living beings. Again, I'm just going to mention this in passing. It's a whole category. I translated the Gita and wrote a long sort of a systematic introduction on it, and I go into this point of equality in the Gita. Another thing is that buddhi is I don't know how you can say it. It's how should I put this? I'm trying to be clever, but it didn't work, so I'll just say it straightforwardly. That because buddhi ultimately comes from the soul, not from the body. The body, you could say, conducts it, just like electricity is conducted in different ways, but the conducting element, like a wire, is not electricity. So our neurological system is conducting consciousness, and so the awareness itself continues in future lives. This course is based on the notion of reincarnation, and that's a whole separate topic I won't go into here. But there is a notion found in the Gita 641 that buddhi sangyogam labhate purvadehikam, that if in this life you are seriously pursuing this buddhi, this metaphysical, this power to reason metaphysically, based on direct experience, then even if you don't finish your path, your spiritual path, the next life, you will recover that awareness which from your previous life. So it's not just a thing of one life. And also when one dedicates one buddhi to the highest truth or God or the absolute or whatever, it leads to liberation. And so then finally, Krishna talks about buddhi and action, the kinds of things that have to be adjudicated or resolved or decided by buddhi. For example, you have the two Sanskrit words prabritting and nibritting, which, anyway, I really like Sanskrit grammar, but I'll restrain myself here. Like when do you go forward? Because, every day in life, there are situations, whether it's a relationship or a particular action or, this or that commitment. When should we proceed and when should we recede, in a sense? When should we go forward? When should we pull back? In general, karya karye, which means what should we do? What should we not do? What is really dangerous? Some people think that philosophy is dangerous. Whereas I think ignorance is actually far more dangerous. So what is really dangerous? What is not dangerous? What will liberate us? What actions, mental and physical actions, actually will liberate us in the various senses of that word, liberate, and what actions will bind us. And of course, Sanskrit word bandha is cognate with English word bind or bound. So what actions are liberating in the highest sense? What actions are binding? What actions will lead us to imprison ourselves? And so it is Buddhi which can understand these things. And specifically Buddhi, which is free of gross selfishness, because, sort of existential confirmation bias, or just the more we are trying to exploit the world, the less we can actually understand it. This is an underlying principle in the Gita, that selfishness blinds us. A word Krishna uses frequently in Sanskrit, avritam, which means covered, that consciousness is covered by various forms of selfishness, greed, lust, and all those famous things. And so if one is, let's say you have a passionate life in the pejorative, not the positive modern sense of passion, like you really love to do something, but passion in the sense of being so attached to one's own purpose and desire that one uncontrollably acts selfishly, maybe may not even be aware of it. So if one is acting selfishly in the world, then one's understanding of all these categories, when to go in, when to pull out, what should I do, what should I not do? Is this dangerous or not dangerous? Will this imprison me if I do this in some cognitive way, or will it liberate me? That someone who's acting impulsively and selfishly will understand these things ayatavat, imprecisely. And if one is really in darkness, to use the Sanskrit word tamo, really in darkness, then one will literally get everything backwards. Sarvartan viparitan cha, one gets everything backwards. So anyway, so my suggestion is that in this Sanskritic culture, and of course I focused on Bhagavad Gita, there's a whole different way perhaps from the Western philosophical tradition, although the Western philosophical tradition is very long, and it really has almost everything if you just look hard enough at different centuries and times and places. There's an amazing variety of approaches to philosophy. And I think there's no lack of resonance with many philosophical and theological traditions in the West. But so that was my purpose here, simply to add this concept, this term, Buddhi or Sankhya, this whole Sanskritic approach to things as a resource, which I think should be taken seriously and could enhance philosophical investigation. So
now perhaps we should conclude. Maybe some conclusions, and we start our discussion.
My conclusion. You want me to? Conclusion? Yeah, I think that some of the really valuable assumptions in the Sanskrit, in this Gita philosophy, are that philosophy somehow, to be done in the best way, should be committed. That philosophy for its own sake, in a sense, is misleading, because we try to understand because we think there's positive value in understanding. It's better to know than not to know, or it's even better to try to know. And so therefore, if we accept that simple conclusion that it's knowledge for our sake, not for its sake, that then we share with the Gita that assumption that somehow the truth will set you free to the extent that you believe that real existential freedom is possible. And so, and therefore, the Gita's conceiving of knowledge or reason as having an analytic or theoretic, but also an applied, practical, existential component, and that you really have to do both to get the full benefit. I think that's very good. And Well, are there any questions at all, or
Okay, maybe let us start the discussion stage. And the first question is mine. Thank you for reconstructing the philosophical context of this book and the context of this notion of Buddhi. So we can assume that if not the whole book, but many passages of this book were composed quite probably at the time of the early sutras, because yes, there are many connections to even inter-school discussions at that time. And the question was from the YouTube channel now, what is the difference in treating this concept of Buddhi from non-orthodox Indian schools like Jainism, Buddhism? Your context, which you have reconstructed now, is quite general for the Indian thinking, and we can try to compare this treating of this notion. So,
Sure.
the first question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, when I was studying and teaching Jainism just within a larger course on the religions of India, the Jains, interestingly, believe there's an eternal soul, but not a God. And so, and of course, there are different kinds of Jainism. They divided pretty early on, roughly geographically, North and South India. But clearly, let's say if the Jains and the people who follow the Gita, which has been by far the most influential work, if they agree on what the basic faculty is, clearly, if someone thinks there is no God, then your concept of connecting is going to be different. Like, what's on the other side of the connection? And your concept of what is that truth that ultimately has to be understood, that's also going to be different. So I think I would almost compare it, let's say, to two scientists who agree on the scientific method but have very different theories on what we're ultimately going to find, and then, or they may interpret data in different ways. So also in the tradition, there's a very influential school that has been, especially among intellectuals, not so much on the ground among, let's say, people in general in India, but among Indian intellectuals, Brahmins, it was very influential. And that is the philosophy of Shankara, which is sometimes called impersonalism. The notion that ultimately, when you discover the truth, it's not personal at all, that God is not personal, we are not persons, and ultimately our very sense of being persons, individual persons, is an illusion. That would take a whole other, practically a series of lectures. But I will say very briefly, I think that conception ultimately, philosophically, breaks down almost immediately and is untenable in many ways. The notion that because if there's only one really existing thing, which is God, then what you can never explain is, why is there illusion? Why do we even have to have this little talk? Why do we have to talk about this? Why do we have to practice yoga? Why do we have to meditate? Why do we have to do anything if we're God? And so the notion of a God who's been sort of cognitively crippled and now has to be, but since there's nothing but God, but crippled God, and so is God self-crippling, but that's not possible because if God is one, there aren't parts or components of God, so there's not a crippling part and a self-enlightening part. So I think it's and that's why ultimately I think the school tended to say, well, you can't describe the truth in words, because I think it's just so non-rational that.
But, okay, thank you. And we have very short time for the next question from Ricardo. So
yeah,
yes, Ricardo, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you for the talk. So at some point of your talk, we spoke like that Buddhi, reason, is part of ourselves, part of the soul. Let's speak like that. So pretty much like the Descartes view of the concept of soul. You can think. But as far as I know, some Indian traditions see Buddhi as something which is outside the soul, like Sankhya itself and yoga, like the Purusha is just an experiencer. It just experience reality, and this Buddhi, this reason, this intelligence is not part of it. So then you are saying that in some sense the concept of soul in the Gita sees Buddhi, reason, as part of the soul.
Good. Yeah. Buddhi in the Gita at one point is described as a material faculty, which is used by the soul. And yet, so it's, for example, if you go with the idea that I am a soul, we just sort of go with this for now. I am a soul. I am eternally a person. I'm eternally a person, an individual soul. And I'm not eternally stupid. I actually have cognitive faculties, and I can reason, and I can understand and appreciate, and so on and so forth. Then, even though, let's say I'm a person, I'm a soul, but when I'm in this material world, I have a material body. I act through this body. I gesture. I see. I hear. So if you have a situation where the soul has originally eternal faculties, but in this world, it's almost like, to function in this virtual reality, or it's like if an astronaut goes to another planet, then you have to have some kind of spacesuit to function on that planet. Even though, let's say, the astronaut is able to breathe, but you need special facilities to breathe in a different environment. And let's say, for example, you went to a planet, obviously an old Star Wars fan, but let's say you go to another planet where there's much more gravity than Earth, or much less gravity. So even though you intrinsically have the ability, let's say, to walk, to move, but in planets with significantly different gravity, you need special suits that allow you to do what you can do normally in your own environment, but to do it in that very different environment. So it's something like that. The soul has the ability to reason and think. However, in this physical universe, the soul takes a body, which includes a Buddhi element, so that the soul can function within the material environment.
So thank you so much for your very impressive talking. So about this great book. So thank you.
Thank you.